The poor girl only wanted to do one kind thing before ending her night shift. An old man was sitting alone by the roadside wearing shabby clothes, his eyes filled with confusion, repeatedly asking the same question, "When will my son come to pick me up?" He had dementia. He could not remember where he lived. He could not remember why he was there. Sometimes he could not even remember his own name. Ruby could not bring herself to leave him alone. She bought him food, took him somewhere safe, and quietly cared for him for weeks, even though she was pregnant herself and so poor that she had to work every night just to survive. She never asked who he was, and she certainly did not know that every time he mentioned his son, he was talking about a man whom the entire city of New York feared, a notorious mafia boss, a man who could make dozens of people disappear with a single phone call. But the most frightening thing was, one day a black car stopped in front of Ruby. A group of bodyguards stepped out. Then a man in a black suit emerged, making everyone around them fall silent. He looked at the old man Ruby had been caring for. Then he looked at her. The mafia boss's eyes were so cold that Ruby trembled with fear. But instead of blaming her for interfering in his family's affairs, he walked toward his father, knelt down beside him, and broke down in tears, because for months not a single member of his family had been willing to care for the old man. Only this poor young woman had. Then the mafia boss turned to Ruby and said something she could never have imagined. "Name your price. I'll give you as much money as you want. Just stay by my father's side." But Ruby shook her head. She had no idea that her answer would make the most powerful man in the city decide to change her entire life. And she certainly did not know. The old man with dementia whom she had rescued was hiding a secret that could bring down the entire mafia empire. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now? And which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States? The United Kingdom? France? Canada? Or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. The wind off the East River cut through Brooklyn like a blade that night, sharp enough to make grown men flinch, and it was in that wind that Cole Ashby had chosen to disappear. He sat with his back against the brick wall of a shuttered pharmacy on Court Street, knees drawn to his chest, a torn army surplus coat 3 sizes too big wrapped around a body that had not eaten a proper meal in 6 days. His beard had grown in patchy and gray with grime. His hands that had once signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, were cracked and trembling from the cold. Nobody walking past him would have believed that underneath the filth was the chairman of Ashby Realty and Hospitality Group, one of the richest self-made men in New York. That was, of course, the entire point. It had been 31 days since his father's stroke. 31 days since Cole had stood in a hospital corridor listening to machines breathe for the only man who had ever taught him anything about survival, and thought, if I drop dead tomorrow, how many people who call themselves my friends would grieve me, and how many would simply grieve the money? He hadn't been able to answer that question. So he had done what any Ashby before him would have called insane, and what he privately called necessary. He had walked out of his own penthouse in a stranger's clothes, and let the city forget his face. He was hungry in a way he had not been hungry since he was 9 years old, back when his father worked double shifts at the docks, and there were nights with nothing but bread and water for dinner. He remembered that hunger now with a strange, aching clarity, how it lived not just in the stomach but behind the eyes, in the way the whole world seemed to tilt and swim if you stood up too fast. He was remembering it tonight, sitting on cold concrete, when the Blacktown car pulled up to the curb across the street. 4 people spilled out of it laughing, dressed for a party he was no longer invited to because, as far as anyone knew, he had vanished from the earth. He recognized the laugh before he recognized the face. Cassidy Lowell. They had known each other since prep school, since a lifetime ago when his family's money had been new and everybody's had been old. "Oh my God," Cassidy said, stopping mid-stride, phone already rising to film. "Look at this. Look at this thing." Her friends gathered behind her, giggling, one of them already recording too. "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble," Cole said quietly, keeping his eyes down, his voice rough with disuse and cold. "Ma'am." Cassidy repeated the word like it was the funniest thing she had heard all year. "Do you hear this? He's got manners. A gutter rat with manners." She crouched slightly, camera angled to catch his face. "You know what you look like. You look like exactly what happens to men who think they're smarter than everybody else. You look like nothing. You are nothing." Say hi to the internet, sweetheart. Something old and buried moved in Cole's chest, not anger exactly, something closer to grief. He said nothing. He had learned in 31 days that silence traveled better than pride. Leave a tip in his cup, Brendan, this is content. Cassidy laughed and they were gone as quickly as they'd come, taillights swallowed by traffic laughter trailing behind them like exhaust. Cole sat very still after they left, staring at nothing, feeling the words settle into him the way cold settles into a body that has stopped fighting it. You are nothing. He had heard versions of that sentence before a long time ago, from people who had no idea that the boy they said it to would one day own the buildings they lived in. It had not hurt any less then. It did not hurt any less now. Half a block away, Ruby Hensley had seen the whole thing. She was standing beside her bicycle outside an all-night diner, an insulated delivery bag slung across her shoulder, waiting on an order of pancakes and coffee that some stranger upstairs wanted delivered before midnight. She was 8 months pregnant, and the bicycle had become, in the last few weeks, an increasingly cruel joke. Her body played on her every hill steeper, every curb higher, her lower back screaming by the second delivery of any given shift. She had not planned on doing this job so late into her pregnancy. She had not planned on doing much of what her life currently required of her. 3 months ago, the father of her child had packed one bag and left a note on the kitchen counter that said in its entirety, "I can't do this." She had read it standing barefoot on cold linoleum, and something in her had gone quiet and hard and very, very tired. She watched the young woman with the phone crouch down in front of the man on the sidewalk, watched her laugh, watched the group climb back into their car like nothing at all had happened, like they hadn't just reached into a lined stranger's chest and taken something from him. Ruby had grown up with a father who used to say that you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by how they treated someone who could do nothing for them in return. Her father had been dead 4 years now, but his voice still lived somewhere behind her ribs, and it spoke up clearly in that moment, watching the town car pull away. She did not go to the man right then. Her legs would not carry her that direction yet. Grief and exhaustion had her rooted to the spot. And besides, the diner door was chiming behind her. Her order finally ready, a stranger upstairs waiting on pancakes he would eat without a second. Thought about where they came from. She picked up the paper bag, felt the warmth of it through the insulated pouch, and something in that warmth made her chest ache. She glanced back once before she pedaled off. The man was still sitting against the pharmacy wall, unmoving, staring at some fixed point on the pavement, like he was trying to hold himself together through sheer force of attention. For a moment, just a moment, Ruby thought she saw something in his posture that didn't belong there. Not the slackness of a man who had given up. Something straighter, watchful, like a person standing guard over the last thing he owned. She told herself it was nothing. She had her own collapsing world to hold up with both hands and no room left over to carry anyone else's. But 3 hours later, at the end of her shift, with her body screaming for sleep and one last unclaimed order of chicken soup going cold in her bag, a customer who'd canceled without warning, Ruby found herself turning her bicycle back, down Court Street instead of toward home. The wind had not let up. If anything, it had grown colder, the kind of cold that got inside a person's bones and stayed there. She could see him from half a block away, still exactly where she'd left him. Shoulders drawn in, tight breath fogging the air in front of his face in short, shallow clouds. She slowed to a stop a few feet away, straddling her bike, one hand resting instinctively over the curve of her stomach, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. For a long moment Ruby Hensley simply looked at him, and he looked back at her with the wary stillness of an animal that had learned the hard way, that kindness could be a kind of trap. "You don't have to be scared of me," she said finally, her voice rough with cold and exhaustion. She reached into the insulated bag hanging from her shoulder and pulled out a paper container, steam curling faintly from the seam of its lid. "Chicken soup. Guy upstairs canceled on me. I'm not going to carry it back, and I'm sure not going to eat it myself. I had a burger an hour ago that's still sitting like a brick." She held it out. "It's still warm. Take it before I have to." He didn't move at first. His eyes went from her face to the container and back again, and something crossed his features that she couldn't quite name. Not suspicion exactly, but its close cousin, the look of a man doing arithmetic on what a kindness might cost him later. "I don't have anything to give you for it," he said. His voice, when it came, surprised her, too clean, too careful, like a voice that had been taught somewhere formal and was working hard to sound like it hadn't been. "I didn't ask you for anything." She crouched down, wincing a little as her knees complained, one hand bracing against her lower back. "Seriously. Eat it before it gets cold. You look like you need it more than the trash can does." Something in that landed differently than she expected. His jaw tightened, and for just a second his eyes went bright and wet before he blinked it back and reached out. careful, almost reverent the way a person reaches for something they've decided in advance not to hope for. His fingers, when they closed around the container, were shaking from the cold, she assumed, though later she would wonder if it had been something else entirely. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I mean that. Thank you. Don't mention it." She lowered herself the rest of the way to sit on the curb beside him, her bicycle leaning against a parking sign a few feet off, and stretched her legs out with a small groan. "God, my feet." He glanced sideways at her, at the unmistakable curve beneath her jacket, at the exhaustion carved into her face. The kind that didn't come from one bad night, but from months of them stacked on top of each other, and something in his posture shifted, some old instinct rising up through the Devonin. 31 days of hunger and cold. "You should be sitting somewhere warm," he said. "Not out here. Not like this." She laughed short and without much humor in it. "Yeah, well, Rent doesn't care what I should be doing." She nodded at the soup, still unopened in his hands. "Eat. It's getting cold, and I worked hard to steal that off a guy who ghosted me." He opened the lid slowly, and the first spoonful he brought to his mouth made his eyes close just for a second, his whole body seeming to soften around the warmth of it in a way that told her more than words could have. She had seen hunger before. She recognized it now, watching him eat like a man rationing something precious, even though there was nothing left to ration. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated a beat too long, a beat that would have meant nothing to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Ruby had spent 3 months learning to read hesitation the hard way, learning what it meant when someone was deciding how much of the truth they could afford to hand over. "Danny," he said. "Ruby." She held out a hand, and after a moment he shook it, his grip gentle, almost apologetic, like he was afraid of breaking something. "You from around here, Danny." "Not originally." That at least seemed to be true, or true enough. "I used to have a life. A different one. It fell apart. I'm figuring some things out." "Yeah." She looked out at the empty street, the wind pushing a plastic bag in slow tumbling circles across the asphalt. "Life's got a way of doing that to people. Falling apart, I mean. You blink and it's just gone. Different. You too." His voice was careful, like he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. She rested a hand on the curve of her stomach, an unconscious gesture, one she made 100 times a day without noticing anymore. "Boyfriend left when I told him I was pregnant. Left a note on the counter. 11 words. I counted them so many times. I probably don't need to count them anymore." She shrugged a small, tired movement. "Mom wants me to marry some guy she found who supposedly has money. I deliver food 80 hours a week, and I still can't always make rent. So, yeah, falling apart's the general theme of the year." He was quiet for a moment, watching her with an intensity that made her glance over, half expecting pity in his face. What she found instead was something closer to recognition, the look of a man who had once stood exactly where she was standing, or somewhere close enough to it that the distance didn't matter. "Whoever that boyfriend was," he said slowly, "he doesn't deserve to know what he walked away from." The words landed somewhere soft in her chest, somewhere that had gone numb months ago and hadn't expected to feel anything again so suddenly. She looked away, first embarrassed by how much the sentence had cost her to hear. "My dad used to say something," she said, mostly to fill the silence, mostly because it felt important somehow to say it out loud to someone. "He passed a few years back. But he used to tell me, whenever you see somebody who's fallen, whoever they are, whatever happened to them, you give them your hand first. You ask questions later if you ask them at all." He said the world's already too quick to walk past people. Said it doesn't cost you anything to be the one who doesn't. Danny was very still, listening to her, the way some people listen to music they're afraid will end too soon. "He sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was the best man I ever knew." Her voice caught just slightly on the word "was," and she cleared her throat and looked up at the sky instead, at the thin scatter of stars managing to fight through the city's haze. "I think about him a lot lately, especially now, wondering what he'd say if he could see me right now, out here at midnight, 8 months pregnant, giving soup to a stranger on a curb instead of going home to sleep. What do you think he'd say?" She considered it, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the corner of her mouth pulled up into something that was almost a real smile. "I think he'd say I finally learned the lesson he was always trying to teach me." They sat like that for a while, neither of them in any hurry to break it, the city moving around them in its usual indifferent rhythm, a bus sighing to a stop somewhere down the block, a siren rising and falling in the distance, the wind combing through the bare branches of a single stunted tree someone had planted in a sidewalk grate years ago and mostly forgotten about. It should have felt strange, two strangers from opposite ends of the world sitting shoulder to shoulder on a frozen curb. Instead, it felt to both of them like something neither had realized they were missing until it was suddenly quietly there. "I should get home," Ruby said eventually, though she made no move to stand. "Baby's got me up every 2 hours, as it is no sense giving her a head start tonight." I think so. Haven't confirmed it. Just a feeling." She pushed herself up slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back, and reached for her bicycle. "You gonna be okay out here?" Something flickered across his face. The ghost of 31 nights of cold, of hunger, of a test he had set for himself that he was only now beginning to understand the true cost of. "I'll manage," he said. "I always do." "Well," she swung a leg over her bike, steadying herself against the curb. "I do this route most nights. Court Street, then up toward the park. If you're still around tomorrow, I might have more soup that somebody didn't want." "I'd like that," he said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in longer than he could remember. She pedaled off into the dark taillight, blinking red against the black street, and Danny Ashby Cole, though she didn't know it yet though, for a little while longer he would let her not know it, sat alone against the cold brick wall, an HEC lake, empty soup container cradled in his hands like something worth more than anything in his penthouse 40 blocks away, and felt for the first time in 31 days something in his chest that was not quite hope, but was standing very close to it. A few days later, Ruby sat in the fluorescent-lit waiting room of Silver Oaks Home Care Agency, filling out paperwork with a pen that kept skipping ink, and told herself not for the first time that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Delivery money alone wasn't going to cover the crib, the hospital bill, the security deposit on an apartment that didn't have mold creeping up the bathroom wall. So when a flyer at the diner had advertised overnight caregiver positions, no license required, just patience and a willing heart, she had circled the number and called before she could talk herself out of it. The woman who interviewed her, a brisk, kind-eyed supervisor named Denise, had looked at Ruby's swollen ankles and her rounded stomach with open concern. "You sure about this, honey? Overnight shifts on your feet some of the time. In your condition." "I need the work," Ruby said simply. "I'm careful. I don't mind hard." Denise had studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly the way people did when they recognized something true and didn't need it, explained twice. "There's a family on Remsen Street. Private client, not one of our regular contracts. They specifically asked for someone patient, someone who wouldn't get rattled easy. Elderly gentleman, memory issues. Family's wealthy, keeps mostly to themselves. Pays well above the usual rate." "What kind of memory issues?" "Officially advancing dementia since his stroke a while back. Some nights he's sharp as a tack. Other nights he doesn't know what year it is." Denise slid a folder across the desk. "Fair warning, the other girls we sent didn't last. Something about the house makes people uneasy. Big money, big silence. You'll understand what I mean." Ruby had shrugged because a paycheck was a paycheck, and by that evening she was standing in front of a limestone townhouse on Remsen Street, with ivy climbing one wall and black iron gates that looked like they'd been built to keep the world out rather than to keep anyone in. The housekeeper, who let her in, a stern older woman named Marguerite, walked her up 3 flights of carpeted stairs, without much conversation, delivering instructions in clipped practice sentences. Mr. Ashby needed his medication at 9, and again at 1 in the morning. He didn't like the television on. He sometimes wandered, so the door to the stairwell had to stay locked. And under no circumstances was Ruby to engage with anything he said about numbers. "Numbers?" Ruby asked. "You'll see." Marguerite's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Just wipe the wall down before you leave in the morning. Family doesn't like walking in on it." The room at the end of the hall smelled of clean linen and something faintly medicinal. An old man sat in a wingback chair by the window, silver-haired, thin in the particular way that spoke of a body that used to carry more weight, more strength, more certainty. His eyes were pale blue, and when they landed on Ruby, something in them sharpened for just a moment, before settling back into a soft, unfocused haze. "Mr. Ashby," Ruby said gently, setting her bag down by the door. "My name's Ruby. I'm going to be looking after you tonight." He studied her for a long moment. "Have we met?" "No, sir." "First time." "Good," he said, and something in the word carried more weight than it should have. "Good. New face. Fewer questions." Ruby didn't know what to make of that, so she simply smiled and busied herself, arranging his water glass, his blanket, the small amber bottle of pills Marguerite had left on the nightstand. Walter Ashby watched her the entire time, with an attention that felt oddly less like confusion and more like careful evaluation, the way a man might watch a stranger he was deciding whether or not to trust. He was quiet company for most of the evening. He asked about her pregnancy with a gentleness that surprised her, wanted to know if she had a good doctor, if she was eating enough, if the father was involved. When she told him briefly that he wasn't, something moved behind Walter's eyes that looked almost like grief on someone else's behalf. Men leave, he said quietly, looking out the window at the dark street below. Sometimes because they're weak. Sometimes because someone made them believe leaving was the only way to keep the people they loved alive. He paused. It isn't always the same thing, you understand. Weakness and sacrifice. People confuse them. Ruby wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said nothing, and after a moment the strange clarity in his voice softened again, drifted the way fog rolls back in after a brief clearing. Around midnight she woke from a light doze in the armchair beside his bed, to the sound of something scratching against plaster. Walter was standing at the far wall, a pencil in his trembling hand, writing in small, careful strokes across the pale blue paint. Ruby sat up slowly, unsure whether to intervene, and watched as he filled line after line with long strings of numbers, his lips moving silently as he worked, his whole body focused, with an intensity that looked nothing like confusion. "Mr. Ashby," she said softly, rising, "you should be resting." He didn't stop writing. "Almost done." "What are you writing?" For a moment, just a moment, his eyes flicked toward her, clear and sharp and entirely present, before the haze slid back over them like a curtain drawn across a stage. "Numbers," he said vaguely. "They come to me sometimes. I don't know why." She helped him back to bed, tucked the blanket around his thin shoulders, and stood for a long time looking at the wall, at the neat, deliberate columns of digits marching from one edge of the plaster to the other. There was something in the precision of it that didn't sit right with what she'd been told about a man, too far gone to know what year it was. Confused, people didn't usually write in straight lines. They didn't usually pause between groups of numbers the way a person pauses between one thought and the next, organizing information, rather than losing it. She thought about wiping it down the way Marguerite had instructed. Her hand actually reached for the damp cloth on the nightstand. But something made her stop. Instead, before dawn broke and Marguerite came to relieve her, Ruby took out her phone and quietly, almost guiltily, photographed each section of the wall, telling herself it was nothing. Telling herself she was only curious, telling herself an old man's confused scribbling couldn't possibly matter to anyone. She wiped the wall clean afterward, exactly as instructed, and said nothing to Marguerite when the housekeeper arrived, brisk and unsmiling, to take over the morning shift. Riding the subway home as the sun came up over the rooftops, exhausted in the particular bone-deep way that came from working 2 impossible jobs, while carrying a third unborn responsibility beneath her ribs, Ruby found herself scrolling back through the photographs on her phone, staring at the long columns of numbers glowing faintly on her cracked screen. Her father had been a bookkeeper for 30 years before his heart gave out at his desk one Tuesday afternoon, and he had taught her patiently over kitchen table evenings when she was young how to read the shape of numbers, how real financial figures had a rhythm to them, groupings that meant something, patterns that random confusion simply didn't produce. She had absorbed it without ever thinking she'd use it for anything beyond balancing her own thin checking account. Looking now at Walter Ashby's wall, illuminated in the gray morning light of a subway car rattling beneath the East River, Ruby felt something cold and unfamiliar move through her chest. These weren't the scribbles of a broken mind. These were account numbers, routing numbers, the kind of precise, structured sequences that belonged to bank ledgers, not confusion. She didn't know yet what they meant, or why a wealthy old man locked behind iron gates on Remsen Street would spend his nights writing them across a wall that someone else was paid to erase by morning. But some instinct, quiet and insistent, told her that whatever she'd stumbled onto in that quiet, medicated room was far larger and far more dangerous than anyone had told her it was. She saved the photographs to a folder she titled simply Walter, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain to herself, she did not delete them. 3 nights later, Ruby found Danny exactly where she'd found him before, though something in him had changed in the time between, a hollowness around the eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there when she'd left him, with an empty soup container, and a small, real smile. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, settling onto the curb beside him, her bicycle propped against the pharmacy wall. "I haven't much." He accepted the paper bag. She handed him a sandwich, this time turkey and cheese, still cold from the diner's refrigerator case, but food all the same, and turned it over in his hands without opening it. "I've been thinking about something you said. About your father. About giving people your hand first." "Yeah, I used to believe something like that too," he said quietly. "A long time ago. Before I learned it wasn't safe to." She wanted to ask what had happened to make him stop believing it, but something in the careful way he held himself told her the question would close a door rather than open one. So instead, she let the silence sit between them, comfortable in the way silences had started to become between 2 people, who had, without quite meaning to, begun looking for each other in the dark. They talked for over an hour that night about small things, safe things, the kind of conversation 2 people have when they are each carrying something too heavy to set down in front of a stranger just yet. He asked about the baby again, about names she'd considered, and she found herself telling him more than she'd told almost anyone, including her own mother. There was something about him that made honesty feel less dangerous than it usually did. Before she left, he asked almost shyly if she had a phone number he could reach her at in case he needed. He hesitated over the word help sometime. She gave it to him, and he typed it carefully into an old cracked phone he pulled from the depths of his coat. The kind of phone that looked salvaged rather than purchased. And for the first time since she'd met him, Ruby saw something that looked almost like relief settle into his shoulders. "Now I can find you," he said. "If I ever need to. Or if you just want soup," she said, and he laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, like the sound had been rusted shut somewhere inside him and had only now creaked open. She didn't know, riding home that night with the wind at her back, that it would be the last time in a long while that reaching him would be so simple. The call came at 3 a.m, and it changed everything before Cole Ashby had even opened his eyes. He had fallen into a shallow, uneasy sleep against the pharmacy wall, the cracked phone tucked inside his coat against his chest for warmth, as much as safekeeping, when it buzzed hard enough to wake him. Petey Voss's name lit the screen, and Petey's voice when Cole answered was tight with a fear that cut straight through 31 nights of exhaustion. "You need to come in. Now. It's your father." The details arrived in fragments during the taxi ride uptown. Cole, still dressed in the filthy coat, still smelling of the street, ignoring the driver's wary glances in the rearview mirror. His father had suffered some kind of episode overnight. Not a second stroke. The doctors weren't certain yet what exactly had happened, but severe enough that the private physician on retainer had insisted on immediate transport to the blank and hospital. Cole sat in the back of that cab with his hands shaking, and for the first time in a month, the disguise he had built so carefully around himself felt less like an experiment in humility and more like a costume. He was trapped inside of, unable to get free fast enough to reach the one person left in the world who had built him. He didn't think about the old cracked phone in his coat pocket. He didn't think about Ruby waiting somewhere across the borough with a number saved in her contacts that would soon connect to nothing at all. He thought only about getting to the hospital, about a father who had taught him everything he knew about survival, lying somewhere behind a set of doors Cole wasn't yet allowed through. The phone slipped from his pocket, somewhere in the chaos of the emergency room entrance, in the scramble of stepping out of the cab too fast, of pushing past security guards, who took one look at his filthy coat and moved to block his path, before Petey came running to vouch for him of the general storm of one of the worst nights of his life. It fell unnoticed onto the concrete outside the hospital doors, and was crushed under the wheel of an ambulance backing into its bay. 20 minutes later, the screen shattering into something beyond repair, the only number he had for the one person in the city who had shown him unguarded kindness, disappearing into a handful of broken glass and plastic. He wouldn't realize it was gone until the following evening, exhausted, hollow, standing once again outside the hospital in the same clothes he'd worn for over a month, reaching instinctively for the phone that was no longer there. Ruby waited 2 nights before she let herself worry. The third night, standing on Court Street in the cold with a sandwich going stiff in her delivery bag, she told herself he'd probably moved on, found a shelter bed somewhere, gotten lucky in some way. That meant he no longer needed a stranger's leftovers. She told herself that, and made herself believe it enough to go home. By the 5th night, worry had curdled into something closer to grief. A small, strange grief for a man she barely knew, whose last name she'd never learned, whose absence left a hole in her routine that surprised her with its size. She texted the number he'd given her twice, watched both messages sit unanswered, the little check marks never turning blue. She told herself it didn't matter. She had bigger things to worry about: rent due at the end of the week, a baby due in a matter of weeks after that, a body that ached in new and inventive ways every single day. She had no room, she reminded herself. Sternly pedaling home alone through streets that felt colder now for reasons that had nothing to do with the weather, to grieve a stranger who had probably forgotten her the moment something better came along. But some nights, lying awake in her narrow bed, listening to the radiator clank and hiss, she found herself thinking about the way he'd said thank you over a paper cup of soup, like she'd handed him something far more valuable than food. She thought about the careful, formal way he spoke, like a man translating himself out of a language he'd learned somewhere far from where he'd been born. She thought about the flicker of pain that had crossed his face whenever she mentioned money or family, or home's small, quick flinches like old bruises, pressed without warning. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know where he slept on the nights he wasn't on Court Street. She didn't know, and had no way of finding out, that the man she'd fed soup to twice on a freezing sidewalk was at that very moment standing at his unconscious father's bedside in a private hospital room 40 floors above a bed. City that had no idea its most powerful, most guarded, businessman had vanished from public life a month earlier, or that he was currently more terrified than he had been in 20 years. Not of losing his empire, not of the shareholders whispering about his disappearance, but of losing the one man who had ever taught him what it meant to survive. She only knew that the wind on Court Street felt colder without him there, and that some quiet, stubborn part of her refused to stop watching for him anyway, night after night, even as the weeks began slowly to pile up between them like snow. No one had bothered to shovel. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and faintly of the cedar cologne Walter Ashby had worn every day for as long as Cole could remember, the housekeeper having brought a small collection of his personal effects from Remsen Street in a misguided attempt to make the sterile room feel more like home. Walter lay motionless beneath a thin blue blanket, an oxygen line taped beneath his nose, his chest rising and falling in the shallow, mechanical rhythm of a man being kept alive by machines rather than by will. Cole sat in the chair beside the bed, still wearing the ragged coat, still unshowered, his hand wrapped around his father's, and did not move for the better part of 2 days. It was Petey Voss who finally coaxed him out of the room gently, the way a man learns to handle something fragile after breaking too many things in his life already. "You need to eat something that isn't hospital coffee," Petey said, setting a paper bag from the deli downstairs on the small table beside the window. "And you need to shower, brother, because I love you, but you smell like you've been living in a dumpster." "Close enough," Cole said, and something in his voice, flat, exhausted, older than it had sounded a month earlier, made Petey's easy smile falter. Petey Voss had known Cole since they were 9 years old, 2 skinny kids from the same block in Red Hook, who had grown up sharing everything from bunk beds to bad decisions, long before either of them had a dollar to their name. Petey had followed Cole into the family business the way a man follows a brother into war, not because he understood every part of it, but because loyalty had never once in 25 years asked him to. He'd grown thinner and grayer over the last decade than a man his age. Should a chronic condition in his lungs that left him breathless on stairs and dependent on an inhaler he kept in every jacket pocket he owned, but nothing about his body's weakness had ever touched the fierce, unshakable steel of his devotion to Cole Ashby. "Talk to me," Petey said, pulling a chair up beside him. "Where have you been for a month? I had half the security team combing this city for you. Your father was asking for you before all this, every single day, and you were just gone." Cole rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough scrape of a beard he hadn't recognized in the mirror that morning. "I needed to know," he said slowly, "who I was to people who didn't know what I could do for them. I needed to know if there was anyone left in this city who'd give me something without wanting something bigger back." And something shifted in Cole's expression, the ghost of a memory, warm despite everything. A paper cup of soup pressed into cold hands on a colder night. "There's someone," he said quietly. "A woman. I don't even know her last name. I lost the only way I had to reach her the night Dad." He stopped, swallowed. "I need to find her again." Petey studied him for a long moment, the way he'd studied Cole 1,000 times over 3 decades of friendship, reading whatever lived underneath the words. "We'll find her," he said simply. "But right now, brother, I need you thinking about something else too. While you were gone playing ghost on the streets of Brooklyn, Derek's been busy." Cole's jaw tightened. "Busy how?" "He's been meeting with lawyers. Quietly. The kind who specialize in guardianship petitions." Petey pulled a folded document from his jacket, worn soft at the creases from being carried and reread too many times to count. "He's building a case that your father's mental state has deteriorated to the point where he needs a court-appointed guardian to manage his affairs. And with you missing for a month, and unreachable, Derek's positioning himself as the only responsible party left standing. That's insane. Dad's sharp. He has good days and bad days, everyone knows that, but he's not. I know that. You know that. But the doctor's notes from these last few months don't paint quite that picture, and I don't think that's an accident." Petey's eyes were grim. "Someone's been feeding information to your father's care team, making his bad days look worse than they are, making his good days disappear from the record entirely." Cole sat back slowly, the pieces arranging themselves into a shape he didn't want to see but couldn't stop seeing. Derek, his younger half-brother, sharp-suited and smooth-voiced, who had spent the last 5 years climbing through the company's finance division, with an ambition that had always felt to Cole 1 degree too hungry to be entirely comfortable. Derek, who had never quite forgiven their father for making Cole chairman instead of him, despite, or perhaps because of the fact that Cole had built half the company's current empire with his own 2 hands, while Derek had inherited his position at the top of it. "If he gets guardianship," Cole said quietly, "he doesn't just control Dad's medical decisions. He controls the trust. The company shares. Everything." "Everything," Petey confirmed. "And there's a hearing being fast-tracked for later this month. Your disappearance made it easy. A chairman who vanishes without explanation for a month doesn't exactly inspire a judge's confidence that the family's got things under control. Cole closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it settle over him like something physical, pressing down on shoulders already carrying more than they were built for. A month ago, he had walked away from all of this to test whether people's kindness could survive the absence of his money. He had found an answer to that question on a cold curb on Court Street, in the form of a stranger's soup and a stranger's steady, unguarded eyes. But in the process, he had left the empire and the father he'd sworn to protect, standing undefended against a threat that had apparently been growing in the shadows the entire time he was gone. "I need to see the medical records," Cole said. "All of them. Every note Derek's lawyers are planning to use. I've already started pulling what I can." Petey hesitated, then added more quietly, "There's something else. Small thing, probably nothing, but your father's had a private caregiver rotating through some nights. Someone outside the usual agency roster. Marguerite mentioned it when I was asking questions at the house. Said the girl's been good with him. Patient. Said your father seems calmer on the nights she's there than he does most other times." Something in Cole went very still, though. He couldn't have said why not yet. Not with the fragment of information Petey had offered him being so small, so seemingly unconnected to anything. "What's her name?" "Didn't get it. I can find out if it matters." "It might," Cole said slowly, though. The thought that followed, quiet, unformed, not yet ready to be spoken aloud, was less about the caregiver herself than about the strange, persistent ache in his chest that had not eased once since the night. His phone shattered outside these very doors, the ache of a debt he owed to a woman whose face he could still see clearly, and whose name, whose whole life, was slipping further away from him with every day he spent trapped inside a hospital room and a legal battle he hadn't known he was fighting. Outside the window, the city moved on the way. It always did, indifferent to the small, desperate wars being fought inside its buildings. A father lying unconscious in a hospital bed while his sons circled each other over what remained of his legacy, and somewhere out there, unreachable, a woman with tired eyes and a stubborn, generous heart wondering if the stranger she'd fed on a freezing sidewalk had simply been another person who'd disappeared from her life without a word of explanation. Cole reached for his father's hand again and made himself a quiet, private promise that whatever it cost him, he would not let either of them go without a fight. A few days later, with his father stable but still unconscious, and Petey's warnings about Derek's guardianship petition ringing in his ears, Cole made the decision to return to the Remsen Street townhouse for the first time in over a month. He needed something the lawyers had asked for: old financial records, correspondence, anything that might demonstrate a pattern of clear-headed decision-making in his father's recent past, evidence that could be set against whatever version of decline Derek's medical experts were preparing to present in court. Walter's private study sat behind a locked door on the 3rd floor, a room Cole had rarely been permitted to enter, even as a grown man, his father guarding it with the particular jealousy of someone protecting more than paperwork. The room was exactly as he remembered it. Dark wood shelves, the smell of old leather and pipe tobacco long since abandoned, a heavy oak desk, positioned to face the window rather than the door, as though Walter had always wanted his back covered. Cole stood in the doorway for a long moment before he made himself cross the threshold, some old childish instinct, still half expecting to be caught and sent away. He worked through the desk drawers methodically at first, in the careful, businesslike way. He approached everything, setting aside ledgers and correspondence that might be useful, until his hand found a drawer that stuck, resisting, warped slightly out of its frame, in a way that suggested it had not been opened in years. He worked it loose with more force than he intended, and it came free all at once, spilling its contents across the desk's surface in an untidy cascade. Beneath a stack of yellowed insurance documents half buried was a small wooden box, its hinges stiff with disuse, its surface worn smooth in places by hands that had clearly opened and closed it many times over many years before whatever instinct had finally sealed it away for good. Cole lifted the lid slowly, and the first thing he saw was a photograph. His mother, Eleanor Ashby, young and laughing, in a way Cole barely remembered, her laughing sunlight caught in her hair. An infant Cole himself, he realized, with a strange lurch in his chest, balanced on her hip. He had exactly 3 photographs of his mother in the world, kept in a drawer in his own apartment, worn soft at the corners from handling. He had never seen this one. He turned it over. On the back, in his mother's looping, familiar handwriting, was a short note for Walter: "So you remember what we're fighting for," and beneath it a date. Cole read the date twice, then a third time, certain he had misunderstood it. Certain the ink had simply faded in a way that made one number look like another. But no matter how many times he read it, the date remained exactly what it was. 3 years after his mother had died. His hands had gone cold. He set the photograph down carefully as though it might shatter, and dug further into the box more photographs, a handful of letters in the same looping hand. A small gold locket he didn't recognize, and beneath all of it a folded newspaper clipping so brittle it nearly crumbled at his touch. He unfolded it with exaggerated care. It was an obituary. His mother's obituary, the one he had read 100 times as a boy, memorized so completely he could have recited it from memory even now 20 years later. Eleanor Marie Ashby, beloved wife and mother, passed peacefully after a long illness. He had grown up believing every word of it. He had grieved her for 2 decades, believing every word of it. But the letters in the box beneath it were postmarked years after that obituary had run in the newspaper, addressed in his mother's own hand. And though Cole's fingers shook too badly to open more than one of them, the single line he managed to read before his vision blurred was enough to unmake something inside him that he hadn't known was still standing. I think about him every single day. Tell him I love him if you ever find it safe to. Cole sat down hard in his father's chair, the letter still clutched in one trembling hand, and for a long moment he simply could not breathe. He thought of himself at 8 years old, standing in a church pew in a suit that didn't fit, staring at a closed casket he had been told contained his mother, while his father stood beside him dry-eyed and rigid, and said only, afterward in the car, "Grief doesn't build anything. You cry once, and then you get up and you keep moving. That's the only lesson that matters." Cole had absorbed that lesson so completely it had become the architecture of everything. He was the careful distance he kept from everyone the way he had never, not once in 34 years, let himself need another person the way a small boy had once needed his mother. He had built an empire on that lesson. He had also, he understood now, sitting in a dead room full of a father's buried secrets, built a kind of prison. He didn't know yet what any of it meant. He didn't know if his mother was still alive somewhere, or if these letters were the last echoes of a woman who had in fact died, sometime after that obituary ran her true death simply never announced. He didn't know why his father, his steady, unshakable father, the man who had taught him that love was a weakness he could not afford, had kept a locked box of proof that everything Cole believed about his own childhood might be built on a lie. He only knew that he could not in this moment ask him. Walter lay unconscious in a hospital bed, 40 blocks away, tethered to machines that might or might not give him the chance to answer for any of this. And Cole was suddenly achingly aware of how much time might have already run out for the truth to ever be spoken aloud between them. He sat in the dark study for a long time, the box open on the desk before him, the photograph of his mother's laughing face turned up toward the ceiling, and let himself, for the first time in decades, simply feel the size of what he had. Lost not once, it seemed now, but twice. Once as a child grieving a woman he'd been told was gone, and now as a man grieving the possibility that she might never have been gone at all, that somewhere out there a mother had spent years writing letters to a son who never received a single one of them. He thought unbidden of Ruby, of the steady, unguarded way she had spoken about her own father dead, 4 years, and still so clearly alive, in the way she carried his lessons forward into every small kindness she offered strangers on a cold street. He envied her that, suddenly and fiercely, she had lost her father and kept him whole inside her. Cole had lost his mother and discovered 20 years too late that the grief he'd built his entire adult life around might have been standing on nothing at all. It was, he realized, sitting alone in his father's locked study, with the wind picking up outside the window, exactly why he had never let himself want anything as simple and dangerous as what he'd felt sitting beside Ruby on that curb, a warmth that asked nothing of him, that didn't calculate what it might cost. He had spent his whole life bracing for loss, because loss in his experience arrived without warning and without explanation, and left nothing behind but a closed casket and a father telling him not to cry. He closed the box carefully, gathered the letters, the photograph, the fragile obituary, and locked them inside his own briefcase rather than leaving them behind in a room that had already kept them hidden for far too long. He did not tell Petey what he'd found. He did not yet know how to say it, even to himself, in words that felt real rather than impossible. He only knew, walking out of the Remsen Street townhouse into an evening grown suddenly colder, that some door inside him, long sealed, carefully guarded, had cracked open, and that whatever waited on the other side of it would not let itself be closed again. A few weeks passed, and the city settled into the particular gray hush of early winter, the kind of cold that made people walk faster and talk less, heads bowed against the wind. Ruby Hensley's due date crept closer with every one of those weeks, a fact her body reminded her of constantly in the ache that had settled permanently into her lower back, in the way she now had to stop twice on the stairs to her 4th floor walk-up, just to catch her breath in the mason lay. Small, insistent flutter of movement beneath her ribs that had grown over the months into something closer to a full conversation. She still worked the delivery routes most nights, though Denise at the care agency had started scheduling her fewer overnight shifts on Remsen Street, gently suggesting that a woman 8 months along shouldn't be climbing 3 flights of stairs in the middle of the night for anyone, however. Good, the pay. Ruby missed those quiet hours with Walter Ashby more than she expected to miss. His strange, drifting kindness missed the odd, careful way he sometimes looked at her like he was trying to memorize her face for later. But she understood the wisdom in stepping back even as money grew tighter with every week that passed. Her mother's apartment in Bay Ridge had become over those same weeks a kind of battlefield Ruby returned to, less and less often and never without armor. "You look tired," her mother said one evening, opening the door before Ruby had even finished knocking the smell of simmering tomato sauce drifting out behind her into the hallway. "Come in, sit down. Eat something that isn't out of a paper bag for once." Deborah Hensley had raised Ruby alone after her husband's heart gave out at his office desk on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and the effort of that of stretching one modest income across every bill, a family generated of watching every dollar twice before it left her hand, had worn a permanent groove of worry into her face, one that had only deepened since Ruby's boyfriend had packed a single bag and vanished without so much as a phone call since. "I'm fine, Mom," Ruby said, easing herself into a kitchen chair with the particular care of a woman whose center of gravity had shifted more than she'd yet adjusted to. "You're 8 months pregnant, working nights on a bicycle in this weather, and you're telling me you're fine." Deborah set a bowl of pasta in front of her without asking the universal love language of mothers who had grown up believing food solved more problems than it actually did. "I worry about you, Ruby. I worry all the time." "I know you do. Then let me help you the way I know how to." Deborah sat down across from her, folding her hands on the table in a way that told Ruby immediately that this was not going to be a simple conversation about pasta. "Grant Wexford called the restaurant looking for you again." Ruby set her fork down. "Mom, I know. But hear me out just once before you say no." Deborah leaned forward. "His family owns half of downtown. Real estate, restaurants, I don't even know what all. He's been asking about you for months, ever since he saw you at Angela's wedding. A man like that, Ruby, he wants to take care of you. He knows about the baby. He told me himself it doesn't scare him off. Some men would run. He's not running." "I don't want a man who's not running," Ruby said, quieter than she meant to something tight and tired in her voice. "I want a man who never would have thought about running in the first place. That's a fairy tale, sweetheart. That's not how the world actually works." Deborah's voice softened, but the worry underneath it didn't. "I loved your father more than anything on this earth, and love didn't stop his heart from giving out at a desk with nothing to show for 30 years of work but a pension that barely covers this apartment. I don't want that for you. I want you to have someone who can actually take care of you and that baby." "Is that so terrible for a mother to want?" "No," Ruby said. "It's not terrible. But I can't marry a stranger because he's got money and Dad didn't. Nobody's saying marry him tomorrow. Just have dinner with him. Let him show you who he is." Ruby was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the bowl of pasta cooling in front of her, and thought unbidden of a man sitting on a cold curb in a coat 3 sizes too big, thanking her for a cup of soup like she'd handed him. Something priceless. She thought of the careful, formal way he spoke, the way his eyes had gone soft and wet the one time she'd mentioned her father's lessons about kindness. She hadn't seen him in weeks now. She told herself most days that it didn't matter, that a man who vanished without explanation was no better than the one who'd left a note on her kitchen counter and walked out the door. But some nights, riding home alone through the cold, she still found herself scanning the sidewalks out of habit, looking for a face she was starting to fear she'd imagined the warmth of. "There's someone," Ruby said finally quietly. Not officially. I don't even know if I'll see him again. But there's someone I think about, and he doesn't have a dollar to his name, Mom, not one that I've ever seen. But when he looks at me, it doesn't feel like he's doing math. It just feels like he sees me." Deborah's face softened some of the sharp worry, easing into something sadder, gentler. "Oh, honey, I know how it sounds. It sounds like you're a romantic, same as your father was, God. Rest him." Deborah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "I just don't want romance to be the only thing you've got when the bills come due and the baby needs a winter coat and a crib. I've lived that life, Ruby. I know exactly how heavy it gets." If you're watching this video and find it interesting and meaningful, don't forget to support our YouTube channel by subscribing or by liking and sharing this video with your friends so they can discover it too. Your support, even simply by subscribing to our channel, is a tremendous source of motivation and joy for our entire team. And now let's continue the story together. I know you do. Ruby squeezed her mother's hand, grateful even through the disagreement for a love that had never once in 27 years failed to show up in some form or another. But I'm not going to marry money just because it's offered to me. I watched you work yourself half to death and still hold your head up. That's the lesson I took from all this, not the one you think you're teaching me. Deborah didn't answer right away, and for a moment the only sound in the small kitchen was the low bubble of sauce still simmering on the stove, and somewhere below, through the thin apartment walls, a neighbor's television murmuring, indistinctly. At least meet him, Deborah said, eventually quieter, now worn down more by love than by argument. One dinner. That's all I'm asking. Ruby exhaled slowly, feeling the baby shift beneath her ribs, a small, insistent reminder of everything at stake in every decision she made, now decisions that no longer belonged to her alone. One dinner, she said finally. That's all. And Mom, if he's anything like the last one who said all the right things and meant none of them, I'm walking out before dessert. Fair enough, Deborah said. And for the first time in the conversation, something like a smile crossed her tired face. Fair enough, baby girl. Later that night, riding the last few blocks home through streets gone quiet and silver with frost, Ruby found herself, without quite deciding, to steering her bicycle down Court Street one more time, past the shuttered pharmacy, past the spot where a stranger named Danny used to sit against cold brick, with nothing but a torn coat between himself and the wind. The spot was empty, as it had been for weeks now. She stood there a long moment anyway, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, breath fogging pale in the streetlight, and let herself feel fully and without flinching how much she missed. A man she barely knew before she turned her bicycle toward home, toward a dinner she had no intention of, enjoying, toward a life that kept insisting gently but relentlessly that she choose between the safety her mother wanted for her and the strange, stubborn hope she couldn't quite let herself let go of. The video found its way to Ruby 3 days later, forwarded by a cousin with the caption, "Isn't this you?" attached to a laughing emoji that made something in Ruby's stomach drop before she'd even opened the link. It was Cassidy Lowell's footage from Court Street, edited, now captioned, set to a mocking soundtrack, uploaded weeks ago to some corner of the internet. Ruby had never had reason to visit, and had somehow, in the merciless algorithmic way of these things, only now begun circulating widely enough to reach her own family. The clip showed the homeless man hunched against the pharmacy wall, Cassidy's cruel laughter ringing over the footage, and then grainy, caught from a passing car's dashboard camera that some stranger had apparently also uploaded weeks later, stitched together by someone with too much time and too little kindness. A second clip. Ruby crouched on the curb beside him, handing over a paper container, her face clearly visible in the orange wash of streetlight. The caption on the compilation read, "Pregnant delivery girl feeding random homeless guy at midnight. Girl, take care of yourself first." By the time Ruby arrived at work that evening, 3 coworkers had already seen it. By the time she stopped at her mother's apartment 2 days later, Deborah had seen it too, and the dinner table conversation that had for weeks orbited gently around Grant Wexford's persistent interest sharpened suddenly into something with real teeth. "People are talking, Ruby." Deborah set a mug of tea down, harder than necessary tea sloshing over the rim onto the tablecloth. Aunt Carol saw it. Cousin Denny saw it. Half the building's seen it by now, I'd bet money. So what if they did? So what if, Ruby, you're 8 months pregnant alone at midnight, giving food to a strange man off the street? Do you have any idea how that looks, how dangerous that is? He never once made me feel unsafe, Ruby said, quiet but unmoving. Not once. Not for a second. You don't know him. You don't know anything about him, where he came from, what he's done, why he's out there in the first place. For all you know, for all I know, he's a good man who's had a hard time. Ruby cut in sharper now than she meant to be, exhaustion and defensiveness tangling together in her voice. That's allowed to be true, Mom. Somebody can have nothing and still be worth something. Deborah was quiet for a moment, studying her daughter with an expression that mixed frustration and something gentler underneath it. Something that looked, if Ruby was honest with herself, a great deal like fear. "I'm not saying he isn't a good man," she said finally. "I'm saying I've spent your whole life watching you give and give and give to people who never once thought to ask whether you had anything left over. Your father was the same way. Kindest man I ever knew, and it never once put food on our table." "It put something better on the table," Ruby said. "It put us at a table where I could look at myself in the mirror. That has to count for something." The dinner with Grant Wexford happened 2 nights later at a restaurant, so quietly expensive that Ruby felt out of place before she'd even sat down, painfully aware of the maternity dress she'd bought secondhand, and the chipped polish on her nails. Grant himself was handsome, in the practiced, symmetrical way of men who had never once had to work for anyone's approval, charming in a manner that felt to Ruby rehearsed rather than genuine, every compliment landing a half second, too smoothly. Every question about her life circling back eventually to some quiet demonstration of what he could offer instead. "I don't need you to worry about money ever again," he told her at one point, leaning forward with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to closing deals. "Whatever this baby needs, whatever you need, that's not a question anymore if you're with me. I take care of what's mine." Something in the phrasing sat wrong with Ruby, a small cold splinter working its way under her skin. What's mine? Not what I love, not what matters to me. She thought unbidden of a man on a curb who had thanked her for a paper cup of soup, like it was the most valuable thing anyone had given him in years, who had asked about her father's lessons with genuine hungry attention rather than polite indulgence, who had never once in every conversation they'd shared made her feel like a problem waiting to be solved with someone else's money. "That's very generous," Ruby said carefully, "but I'm not looking to be taken care of. I'm looking for somebody who sees me as a person, not a situation to manage." Something flickered behind Grant's easy smile, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Of course," he said smoothly. "That's not what I meant at all." She left before dessert exactly as she'd promised her mother. She might walking out into the cold night air with a strange hollow feeling in her chest that had less to do with Grant Wexford's disappointment and more to do with the ache of missing someone she could no longer even text. Across the city, in a cramped office above a deli in Red Hook that served as unofficial headquarters for matters Cole preferred to keep away from the family's official channels, Petey Voss sat hunched over a laptop, dark circles under his eyes, an inhaler resting within easy reach beside a cold Gocco cup of coffee. He had spent the better part of 3 weeks doing exactly what Cole had asked of him, building a case quietly against the guardianship petition. Derek's lawyers were preparing to file cross-referencing medical records against Walter's known schedule, looking for any pattern that might expose the manipulation Petey was increasingly certain was happening beneath the surface of his old friend's father's care. What he had not expected to find buried in a routine background check on the private caregiving staff cycling through the Remsen Street townhouse was a series of small, strange numbers scrawled in the margin of a nursing supervisor's incident. Log a note about a wall needing to be repainted. The mention of a caregiver named R. Hensley, who had been let go from the overnight rotation the same week that log entry was filed. Petey almost scrolled past it. He'd almost dismissed a dozen similarly minor details over the last 3 weeks, chasing threads that led nowhere. But something about the phrase "numbers on the wall" caught at a memory he couldn't quite place. Some conversation with Cole weeks earlier, half formed and half forgotten in the chaos of Walter's hospitalization. He sat back slowly, rubbing his eyes, and reached for his phone to call Cole, then stopped, reconsidering, deciding this was worth investigating properly, before he brought half-formed suspicions to a man already carrying more weight than any one person should have to. Instead, he pulled up the caregiving agency's public records, cross-referenced against employment files Derek's own legal team had unwittingly made discoverable in the guardianship filing, and began methodically the way he'd learned to do everything in this business to build a picture of who exactly R. Hensley was, and why, out of every overnight caregiver who had ever passed through that house, she was the one whose supervisor's notes kept circling back again and again, to a wall that someone upstairs seemed unusually determined to keep clean. By the time the sun rose over Red Hook, Petey had a name, an address, and a growing uneasy certainty that whatever Walter Ashby had been writing on his bedroom wall every night for months, it was not the meaningless static of a failing mind, and that the woman who'd been quietly documenting it for reasons Petey didn't yet understand might be the single most important person in this entire fight, whether she knew it or not. It took Petey 2 more days to be certain, and when certainty finally arrived, it arrived like a fist to the chest. He had pulled Derek Ashby's financial disclosures from 3 separate filings: the guardianship petition, an old shareholder report, a routine audit trail Petey had access to, only because Cole had never revoked his old security clearances, some habit of trust neither of them had ever thought to question. Buried in the audit trail, cross-referenced against a set of offshore holding accounts registered under a shell company with a name so deliberately forgettable it might as well have been designed to escape. Notice Petey found routing numbers. He set them beside the numbers scrawled in the incident log, the ones a nursing supervisor had jotted down in passing, annoyed at having to repaint a wall, never once imagining she was documenting evidence of a crime. They matched, not approximately, not similarly, exactly digit for digit across 4 separate account groupings. Petey sat very still in the cramped office above the deli for a long time. After that, his coffee gone cold beside him, his inhaler forgotten on the desk, feeling the full, terrible weight of what he was looking at settle into his chest. Derek Ashby, Golden Boy Sharp, Suits the brother who'd never quite hidden his resentment at being passed over for the chairmanship, had been quietly siphoning money out of the family's holdings for what looked like years, funneling it through accounts designed to be untraceable by anyone who wasn't already looking for them. And somehow, impossibly, Walter Ashby, supposedly too far gone in his own mind to be trusted with the smallest decision about his own life, had been writing those exact numbers on his bedroom wall night after night in a room where a caregiver named Ruby Hensley was quietly, methodically photographing them before anyone could wipe them away. It didn't make sense as an accident. Nothing about it made sense as an accident. Petey didn't call Cole. Not yet. He told himself it was because he needed to be certain before he handed his friend something this explosive. But underneath that reasoning sat something rawer, a old protective instinct, the same one that had gotten him beaten up twice in the Prussid, 8th grade, defending Cole against kids who'd mocked his family's secondhand shoes. Whatever this woman knew, whatever role she was playing in all of it, Petey intended to find out himself alone, before he let anyone else near it. He found Ruby's address easily enough. The caregiving agency's records had been thin on protections, and Petey had spent 20 years learning how to find things people didn't necessarily want found. He waited outside her building the following evening, watching a steady stream of strangers come and go through the narrow front door, until finally, close to 9 o'clock, he saw her unmistakably pregnant moving carefully down the front steps with a delivery bag slung over one shoulder, her breath fogging pale in the cold. Ruby Hensley. She turned wary immediately, one hand instinctively curving over her stomach. "Who's asking? My name's Petey Voss. I work for the Ashby family." He watched her face carefully as he said the name, looking for the flicker of recognition, of guilt, of anything that might confirm the suspicion sitting cold in his chest. What he saw instead was simple confusion, quickly hardening into caution. "Okay," she said slowly. "And I need to ask you about Walter Ashby. About your nights caring for him. About the wall in his bedroom." Something shifted in her expression, then not guilt, Petey noted, but something closer to alarm quickly masked. "I don't work for that family anymore. Not for a few weeks now. That's not what I asked. Look, I don't know what this is about, but I'm tired. I'm 8 months pregnant and I've had a long shift. If you've got a question, ask it plain, or I'm going inside." Petey stepped closer, lowering his voice, some hard protective edge creeping into it that he rarely let anyone see. "I know about the numbers, Miss Hensley. I know you photographed them. I want to know why." For a moment, real fear crossed Ruby's face. The particular fear of someone who has stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than they understood at the time, and is only now standing on a dark street with a stranger who clearly knows more than he's saying, beginning to grasp the size of it. "I didn't do anything with them," she said, quieter now, defensive. "I found some old photographs on my phone and I was going to delete them. I don't even know why I kept them this long. If somebody sent you here thinking I stole something or sold something, that's exactly what I'm trying to figure out," Petey said, and he heard even as he said it how accusatory it sounded, how much like an interrogation rather than a conversation. Weeks of stress, of watching Derek circle closer to the guardianship hearing, of carrying alone the weight of protecting a friend who had no idea how close he was to losing everything, had worn something raw and suspicious into Petey that he didn't usually let show. A vulnerable old man writes numbers on a wall every night for months, and the one caregiver who doesn't get rattled by it happens to be quietly documenting them on her phone. "Forgive me if that doesn't look like nothing." "It wasn't for anybody," Ruby said, and now there was real heat in her voice, real hurt beneath the anger. "I didn't do it for money or for whoever you think sent me. I did it because it didn't feel right watching an old man get treated like he was already gone when I didn't believe he was. That's the whole reason. That's it. You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," Ruby snapped, and something in the exhausted, unguarded fury of it made Petey pause, some old instinct. The same one Cole trusted to read a room, a person a lie, catching on the raw honesty underneath. Her anger rather than the anger itself. "I've had one of the worst months of my life. My boyfriend left when I told him I was pregnant. I work 2 jobs, I can barely survive to make rent. My own mother's trying to marry me off to some rich man I don't even like because she's scared of what happens to me otherwise. And now some strangers cornering me on my own street, accusing me of what exactly? Stealing bank numbers off a wall. I was told to wipe clean every single morning." Her voice cracked just slightly, and she pressed a hand briefly against her eyes before continuing quieter. "I kept those pictures because something about that man never sat right with me. He looked at me like he knew exactly who he was, and exactly what he was doing every single time, even when everybody around him was telling me he didn't. I don't know what those numbers mean. I don't know what you think I did with them. I just know I didn't feel right pretending I hadn't seen something that seemed like it mattered. Petey said nothing for a long moment, studying her in the wash of a street lamp, the exhaustion carved into her face, the protective way her hand kept returning to her stomach, the raw, unpolished honesty of a woman with nothing left in reserve to perform with. 25 years of reading people for a living had taught him the difference between a well-rehearsed lie and an exhausted, angry truth, and everything about the woman standing in front of him read unmistakably as the latter. "Show me the pictures," he said finally, some of the hard edge leaving his voice. Ruby hesitated, then pulled out her phone, scrolling to the folder she'd titled simply Walter, and held it out. Petey scrolled through them, slowly matching digit against digit in his memory against the audit trail he'd spent 2 days poring over, and felt with each passing photograph the last of his suspicion collapse into something far more scrata, urgent, and far more complicated. "These numbers," he said quietly, almost to himself, "match accounts that Derek Ashby's been hiding money in for years. Real accounts. Real money. Enough to bury him if it's proven." Ruby's face went pale. "I don't understand." "Neither do I, not entirely, not yet." Petey handed her phone back, his mind racing now in an entirely different direction than the one he'd arrived with. "But I think Walter Ashby isn't confused at all, Miss Hensley. I think he's been leaving evidence night after night on a wall he knew somebody would wipe clean by morning evidence against his own son. And I think out of everyone who's walked through that house in months, he chose to leave it on nights he trusted you to be the one watching." Ruby stared at him, the cold forgotten, the ache in her back, forgotten something enormous and unspoken, settling slowly into place behind her eyes. "Why me?" Petey looked at her for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had lost every trace of the suspicion he'd arrived with. "I think," he said slowly, "you're about to find out you matter to this family a great deal more than either of us understood 20 minutes ago." Petey didn't tell her everything that night. Some instinct, the same protective caution that had kept him from calling Cole too soon, told him this was not a conversation to finish on a dark sidewalk with a woman 8 months pregnant and shivering in the cold. Instead, he asked if he could see her again the next evening, somewhere warm, somewhere he could explain properly what he suspected and what it might mean. Ruby agreed, mostly out of exhaustion. Mostly because some part of her, the part that had never quite let go of Walter Ashby's strange, careful kindness during those long overnight shifts, needed to understand what she had stumbled into. They met the following evening at a small diner near her apartment, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a bottomless coffee pot. And Petey arrived with a folder he set on the table between them like an offering. "I need to back up," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. "There's context you don't have. Walter Ashby isn't just some wealthy old man with a private caregiver. He's the father of a man named Cole Ashby. You might know the name. Chairman of Ashby Realty and Hospitality. Runs half the real estate in this borough." Ruby's brow furrowed. "I've heard the name. Never met him." "You have," Petey said quietly. "Just not under that name." He watched the confusion cross her face, watched it deepen into something wary and unsettled, and pressed forward before she could ask the question he could see forming behind her eyes. "Cole disappeared about 2 months ago. Walked away from his entire life, the company, the apartment, everything, because he wanted to know if people would still show him kindness if he had nothing to offer them in return. He's been living on the street ever since, calling himself Danny." The color drained from Ruby's face slowly, the way it does when the ground shifts beneath a person and their body understands it before their mind catches up. "That's not." She started and stopped, her hand pressing flat against the table as though to steady herself. "That's not possible. I know it sounds impossible. I gave him soup," she said half to herself, her voice thin with disbelief. "I gave him a sandwich off my delivery bag because I felt sorry for him. I told him about my father. I told him things I hadn't told anybody." Her eyes came up to Petey's, wide and stricken. "He let me believe he had nothing. He let me feel sorry for him." "He wasn't lying to hurt you," Petey said gently now, some deep loyalty to his oldest friend rising up, even as he understood exactly how this must feel from where Ruby was sitting. "He was testing something in himself, not in you. And from what I understand from the little he's told me, what he found with you was the only real thing that happened to him the entire month he was out there." Ruby said nothing for a long moment, staring down at her hands, working through layers of feeling too tangled to sort in front of a stranger. Betrayal, confusion, and underneath it, unwillingly, something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. The sense of a puzzle finally clicking into a shape that made sense of every strange, careful thing about the man she'd known as Danny. And Walter, she said, finally quietly. The numbers on the wall. Walter is Cole's father. Petey leaned forward. And I don't think he's confused at all, Ruby. I think for months he's been documenting evidence against his other son, Derek, who's been quietly draining money out of the family's accounts. I think Walter doesn't trust anyone left in that house. Not the staff. Not his own family. I think you were the only person who ever walked into that room who wasn't already compromised by Derek's influence, and some part of him understood that, even through whatever fog the stroke left behind. Ruby thought of Walter's pale blue eyes finding hers that first night sharp for just a moment before drifting again. New face. Fewer questions. She thought of the strange, deliberate way he'd written those numbers, pausing between groupings, the way a person pauses between complete thoughts. She thought of the gentle, aching way he'd spoken about men who leave about weakness and sacrifice being two different things people too often confused. He knew, she said slowly. He knew exactly what he was doing every single time. I think so, yes. And nobody believed him. Everybody around him decided he was gone and just kept erasing what he was trying to tell them. Something fierce and furious moved through Ruby. Then an old familiar anger on behalf of someone dismissed and unseen. The same anger that had once made her stop her bicycle on a freezing street for a stranger nobody else would look at. Twice. That's disgusting. That's exactly the kind of thing my father used to warn me about the way this world decides some people don't matter anymore and just stops listening. Petey watched her, something shifting visibly in his expression, the last guarded suspicion he'd carried into this conversation, dissolving into something closer to genuine respect. You kept visiting him even after the agency cut your hours, he said. It wasn't a question. I checked. You went back twice off the books unpaid after Denise pulled you from the overnight rotation because of your pregnancy. Ruby shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. He didn't have anybody else who actually looked at him like he was still in there. Somebody had to. You weren't getting paid for that. I wasn't doing it for money. Petey sat back slowly in the booth, rubbing a hand over his face, and for the first time since he'd cornered her outside her apartment building, something in him softened entirely, the last wall of his suspicion giving way completely. He thought of a nurse's aide who'd once years ago threatened to report Petey's own grandmother's confusion to the state, simply to avoid the trouble of managing her, and how Petey had fought for months to keep her in her own home instead. He recognized, in Ruby Hensley, the same rare, stubborn refusal to let a person become invisible, simply because it was more convenient for everyone else if they did. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I came at you hard the other night, accused you of things you clearly had no part in. You were trying to protect somebody you care about, Ruby said. I get that. I'd probably have done the same thing. Still, Petey exhaled some of the exhaustion of the last several weeks, visible now in the set of his shoulders. I've known Cole since we were 9 years old. I've watched a lot of people come around him for the wrong reasons over the years, money, connections, whatever they thought they could get off him. I've gotten good at spotting it. I didn't spot it in you because there wasn't anything there to spot. He met her eyes. I think you might be the most important person in this entire mess, Ruby. And you didn't even know you'd walked into it. Ruby wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, feeling the baby shift restlessly beneath her ribs, feeling the strange, dizzying weight of everything Petey had just handed her. A man she'd fed soup to on a curb who was impossibly one of the wealthiest men in the city. An old man she'd genuinely come to care for who was impossibly that man's father. Sane and deliberate behind a fog everyone else had accepted as permanent. A conspiracy of stolen money and false diagnoses that had somehow, unbelievably folded her small, exhausted life into its center. What happens now? She asked. Now, Petey said, sliding out of the booth, reaching for his jacket. I take you to see Cole. Because I think he spent 2 months looking for a woman he lost his only way of contacting, and I think he deserves to know she's been standing closer to the middle of his family's crisis than either of us understood. Ruby hesitated, one hand still resting protectively over her stomach, weighing the fear of it against something else. Something that had been quietly, stubbornly alive in her chest for weeks now. Every time she rode her bicycle past an empty curb on Court Street. Okay, she said, finally standing slowly, gathering her coat around her. Take me to him. Outside, the wind had picked up again, cutting sharp down the avenue, but Ruby barely felt it this time, her mind already racing ahead to a reunion she hadn't dared let herself hope for, to a truth about a kind, careful stranger that was about to rearrange everything she thought she understood about. The last 2 months of her life. Petey drove her uptown in silence for most of the ride. The city lights sliding past the windows in long smeared streaks of gold and red. Ruby's hands folded tight in her lap, her heart beating hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She had rehearsed a dozen different things to say and discarded every one of them by the time the car pulled up outside a modest brownstone in Cobble Hill. Not the gleaming penthouse she might have expected from a man of Cole Ashby's reputation, but a quiet, unassuming building with lace curtains in the windows, the kind of home a person chose rather than displayed. "He's been staying here since your father's admission," Petey explained, catching her confusion. "Didn't want the press near the hospital, didn't want to go back to the penthouse and face what it meant to be Cole Ashby again, not yet. This place belongs to an old family friend. Nobody thinks to look here." He led her up the front steps and let them both in with a key calling out softly into the dim hallway. "Cole, you awake?" There was a pause, then footsteps on the stairs, unhurried, and then he was there, and Ruby felt the floor tilt beneath her. He had showered, shaved, changed out of the ragged coat into a plain gray sweater that did nothing to disguise how thin he'd grown. But his face was unmistakably the same face she'd sat beside on a freezing curb, the same eyes that had watched her with such careful, hungry attention over a cup of soup. He stopped dead at the bottom of the stairs, staring at her, as though she might dissolve if he blinked, and for a long moment neither of them said a single word. "Ruby." Her name came out of him rough, disbelieving, like a man saying a word in a language he'd been told he would never get to speak again. "How, Petey, how is she here?" "Long story," Petey said quietly, already retreating toward the kitchen to give them room. "I'll be in the other room if you need me." Ruby stood frozen in the entryway, one hand instinctively resting over the curve of her stomach, feeling the enormity of the last 24 hours crash over her all at once. "Danny," she said, and then hearing how wrong the name sounded now, how small and borrowed, she stopped herself. "Cole. I don't even know what to call you." "Danny's fine," he said softly, crossing the hallway toward her, stopping a careful distance away, as though afraid that closing the gap too quickly might make her disappear. "It was never a lie exactly, just half of it." Half of it, Ruby repeated, some of the hurt she'd been carrying since Petey's revelation the night before rising sharp in her chest. "You let me feel sorry for you. You let me give you the little bit I had, thinking you had nothing when you own half this city. I know how it looks. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a very rich man playing a game with people who don't have the luxury of playing games with their own lives." Something in his face crumpled at that, the words landing exactly where she'd meant them to, and he didn't defend himself, didn't reach for an excuse. "You're right to be angry," he said quietly. "I asked myself more than once out there whether what I was doing was fair to the people I met. I still don't have a good answer for you. I only know that everything I felt sitting beside you on that curb was real. More real than almost anything I've felt in years and years before that." His voice caught, roughened further. "I lost the only way I had to find you again the same night my father collapsed. I've spent 2 months looking for a woman whose last name I never even asked for. Feeling like I'd let the one true thing that happened to me slip through my hands because I panicked and ran to a hospital instead of writing your number down somewhere safer." Ruby's anger didn't disappear, but something in it loosened, softened at the edges, hearing the raw, unguarded regret in his voice. "You could have told me. Any night. You could have just told me the truth. I know." He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if searching for the right words written somewhere on his palms. "I think some part of me was afraid that if I told you, you'd start looking at me the way everyone else does. Calculating. Wondering what you could get or what I wanted from you in return. Nobody's looked at me the way you did in a very long time, Ruby. I wasn't ready to lose that." They stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with everything still unsaid. And finally Ruby crossed the last few feet and sat down heavily on the bottom step of the staircase. Exhaustion and shock and something gentler, all tangled together inside her. Cole sat beside her, careful to leave space, watching her the way a man watches something fragile. He is terrified of frightening away. "Petey told me about your father," she said after a while. "About the numbers. About Derek." She turned to look at him. "I cared for him for weeks, Cole. I had no idea any of this was happening underneath it. I just thought he was a sad, gentle old man that everybody had given up on." "He'd have liked hearing you say that," Cole said quietly. "He talks about you, you know, when he's lucid. Before the collapse, he mentioned you to Marguerite more than once. Said the girl with the kind eyes was the only one in that house who didn't treat him like he was already gone." Ruby felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "I didn't know who he was to you. I would have." She stopped, shook her head. "I don't even know what I would have done differently. I just wish I'd understood what I was looking at sooner." "You understood exactly what you needed to," Cole said. "You kept the truth instead of erasing it when everyone else in that house had been trained to wipe it clean every morning. That's not nothing, Ruby. That might be the thing that saves my father's legacy, and I don't know how I'll ever repay you for it." She was quiet for a moment, studying him in the low light of the hallway, the exhaustion still etched into his face, the careful, guarded way he held himself, even now, even in relief, like a man who had spent his whole life bracing for the blankie, ground to open beneath him. "There's something else," she said slowly. "Isn't there? Something you're not saying." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression cracked open. Some door he'd kept sealed for 20 years, finally giving way under the weight of everything the last few months had shaken loose in him. "I found letters," he said quietly, "in my father's study. From my mother. Postmarked years after she was supposed to have died." His voice wavered, and for the first time since she'd known him, Ruby watched Cole Ashby's composure genuinely fail him. "I don't know if she's alive somewhere right now, or if that's just the cruelest possible ending to a story I've been telling myself since I was 8 years old. I haven't been able to ask my father because he's lying unconscious in a hospital bed, and I don't know if I'll ever get the chance. Cole." Ruby reached out instinctively and rested her hand over his, the first time she had touched him since the night she'd shaken his hand on a cold curb and told him her name. "I've spent my whole life afraid to need anybody," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "My father taught me that love was a weakness right after he told me my mother was gone. I built an entire empire out of never letting anyone close enough to leave. And then I sat down next to you on a sidewalk with nothing to my name, and for the first time in 20 years I felt like maybe wanting somebody didn't automatically mean losing them." He looked up at her eyes, bright, unguarded in a way she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to see. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let myself want something this much without being terrified of what it'll cost me when it's gone." Ruby didn't answer right away. She simply tightened her hand around his feeling, the baby shift beneath her ribs, feeling the strange, enormous weight of two broken, exhausted people finding against every reasonable expectation something steady in each other in the middle of all this wreckage. "Maybe you don't have to know how yet," she said finally, quietly. "Maybe you just start by not running to a hospital and losing my number this time." A sound came out of him that was half laugh, half something closer to a sob, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither one pulled away. The call came through Petey's contact at the hospital 3 days later, and it arrived with the particular urgency of a plan accelerating faster than anyone had prepared for. "Derek's lawyers filed an emergency motion this morning," Petey said, pacing the small kitchen of the Cobble Hill brownstone while Cole sat at the table, a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. "They're citing your father's continued unconscious state as grounds to expedite the guardianship hearing. If a judge grants it before he wakes up, Derek gets full authority over the trust. The company shares everything, before your father's ever had the chance to say a single word in his own defense." "When's the hearing?" 5 days. Maybe less if the judge grants the expedited request." Cole pressed his palms against his eyes, feeling the exhaustion of the last several months settle into his bones in a way sleep alone wasn't going to fix. "The wall photographs. Ruby's evidence. Is it enough?" "It's compelling," Petey said carefully. "But it's not a signed confession. Derek's lawyers will argue the numbers could be anything, random digits from a confused mind, coincidentally similar to account numbers. Nothing conclusive without independent verification from a forensic accountant. And even then, tracing also the money back to Derek specifically instead of some unnamed third party will take time we might not have. Then, we need something conclusive. Fast. There's one thing that might do it," Petey said slowly. "If your father regained consciousness even briefly, even for a few minutes, and was able to speak on record about what he'd been documenting, that changes everything. A judge isn't going to dismiss the direct testimony of the man himself, however brief. He's still unconscious, Petey." "I know. I'm just telling you what would actually move the needle." Cole said nothing for a long moment, staring at the cold coffee in front of him and Ruby sitting across the table with one hand resting on her stomach. Watched something harden in his expression, the exhausted grief of the last week's folding, itself deliberately into resolve. "Then we go with what we have," he said. "Petey, get the forensic accountant moving today. I want every dollar in those offshore accounts traced back to Derek's name by the time we're in that courtroom." The threat arrived at Ruby's apartment 2 days later, in the form of a man she'd never seen before waiting in the lobby of her building when she came down for her evening shift. He was well-dressed, unremarkable in the deliberate way of a person who worked hard to be forgettable, and he fell into step beside her as she walked toward her bicycle, close enough to be unsettling, far enough to claim later that nothing untoward had occurred. "Miss Hensley," he said pleasantly, "Mr. Ashby wanted me to pass along a message." Ruby's grip tightened on her bicycle's handlebars. "Which Mr. Ashby?" "Derek." The man smiled thin and practiced. He wanted you to know he's aware of your recent involvement in a matter that has nothing to do with you. Some photographs taken during your time as a caregiver that seem to have been shared with parties outside the family. He thought you should understand the seriousness of interfering in a private family legal matter, particularly given his eyes flicked deliberately to her stomach current circumstances. A woman in your position can't afford complications. Legal fees. Lost wages from missed work if you were called to testify and this dragged out for months. Stress isn't good for a baby, Miss Hensley. Neither is financial hardship. Ruby felt something cold slide down her spine, fear tangled tight with fury. Is that a threat? It's a courtesy, the man said, still smiling. Mr. Derek Ashby is a generous man to people who understand their place in a situation that isn't theirs to be involved in. He'd be willing to make your inconvenience disappear entirely. A settlement, you might call it. Enough to make sure you and your child never have to worry about money again. All he's asking in return is that those photographs and whatever you think you saw in that house stay exactly where they belong. In the past, Ruby stood very still for a moment, absorbing the shape of what was being offered to her, the particular ugliness of a threat wrapped so carefully in the language of generosity that a person could almost mistake it for kindness. Tell Derek Ashby, she said, her voice low and steady despite the fear still coursing through her, that I didn't do any of this for money, and I'm not going to stop doing it for money either. Tell him I spent months taking care of his father when nobody else in that family bothered to visit, and I watched that man try every single night to tell somebody the truth about what was happening to him. I'm not selling that out because it's inconvenient for his son. Something flickered across the man's practiced smile, not quite surprise, but close to it, the look of a person unaccustomed to an offer being refused. That's a shame, he said, the pleasantness in his voice thinning at the edges. I hope you understand what you're choosing, Miss Hensley. Not everyone in this situation is as generous as Mr. Ashby has been. There are less patient people who might not offer a settlement at all. He walked away before Ruby could respond, disappearing into the evening crowd with the same unremarkable ease he'd arrived with, and Ruby stood alone on the sidewalk for a long moment, one hand pressed against her stomach, her heart hammering before she pulled out her phone with shaking fingers, and called Petey. Cole arrived at her apartment within the hour. Petey close behind him, both men's faces tight with a controlled fury that made Ruby understand for the first time exactly what kind of power and danger existed underneath the careful gentleman she'd fed soup to on a curb. I'm moving you somewhere safe, Cole said. The moment he was through her door, his voice steady but his hands Ruby noticed were not. Tonight, I have a property upstate guarded private. You're not staying somewhere Derek's people know your address. Cole, I have work tomorrow. You're not going to work tomorrow. His voice cracked just slightly, the composure fraying at the edges. Ruby, they threatened you. They threatened the baby. I am not going to sit in a courtroom fighting for my father's dignity while my brother's men are standing in your lobby making veiled threats about your safety. I won't do it. I can't. Ruby looked at him for a long moment, seeing past the fear in his voice to something underneath it. The same old wound she'd glimpsed the night he told her about his mother's letters, the terror of loving something and losing it. Anyway, now sharpened into something desperate and protective. Okay, she said quietly and watched some of the panic ease out of his shoulders. Okay, I'll go. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, careful of her stomach, holding her the way a person holds something they only just realized they could have lost. I should have kept you out of this from the moment Petey found you, he murmured into her hair. I should have protected you better. You didn't put me in this, Ruby said, pulling back just enough to look at him. Your father did when he trusted me with the truth. And I don't regret it, Cole. Not for 1 second. Whatever happens next, I chose this. Same as I chose to sit down next to a stranger on a cold curb 3 months ago. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling his heart beating hard and fast beneath it. You don't have to protect me from choices I already made with my eyes open. Something in his face broke open at that grief and gratitude and fear all tangled together. And he held her tighter. The two of them standing in the small, cluttered apartment while outside somewhere in the city. Derek Ashby's carefully constructed lies continued closing in around a father who could not yet wake to defend himself. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear sunlight, cutting sharp angles across the marble floor of the county courthouse, and Ruby sat in the gallery beside Petey, with her hands folded tight over her stomach, watching Cole take his seat at the petitioner's table beside a lawyer whose calm, measured presence did little to disguise the tension radiating off both men. Derek Ashby sat across the aisle, immaculate in a charcoal suit flanked by 2 attorneys, and an expression of practiced concern that made Ruby's stomach turn. He looked. She thought exactly like a man who had spent years rehearsing what grief and worry were supposed to look like on someone else's face. All rise. The judge entered, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched low on her nose, and the room settled into the particular hush of people about to watch a family tear itself apart in public. Derek's attorney rose first, laying out the case with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who believed he had already won medical documentation, showing a pattern of cognitive decline expert testimony from a physician retained by documentations on a. Derek's team careful emphasis on Cole's unexplained, month-long disappearance as evidence of a family too fractured to manage its own affairs responsibly. Walter Ashby, the attorney concluded, is a man who deserves dignity in his final years, not a family power struggle playing out over his unconscious body. My client seeks only to protect his father's interests during a period when his father cannot protect them himself. When it was their turn, Cole's attorney rose and, without preamble, submitted into evidence a forensic accounting report tracing over $4 million from Ashby family accounts into a network of offshore shells, every routing number matched precisely against digits an elderly man had spent months writing on his bedroom wall. These numbers, the attorney said, were recorded nightly by Mr. Walter Ashby over a period of several months, and preserved by a caregiver who recognized their significance when no one else did. We submit that Mr. Walter Ashby was not experiencing cognitive decline during these episodes. We submit he was documenting evidence of a crime committed against him by his own son. Derek's composure cracked just slightly, a flash of something sharp and furious crossing his face before he smoothed it away. "This is absurd," he said, loud enough to draw the judge's warning glance. "My father is a sick man. You're asking this court to believe a delusional old man somehow orchestrated a forensic accounting scheme in his sleep." "Your Honor," Cole's attorney said calmly, "we'd like to call our final witness." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Walter Ashby entered in a wheelchair, thinner than Ruby remembered his silver hair, combed neatly, a private nurse walking close beside him. But his eyes were clear, sharp, entirely present in a way Ruby had only glimpsed in brief, fleeting moments during all those long overnight shifts. A soft gasp moved through the gallery. Derek went white. "That's not possible," Derek said, half rising from his seat. "He's been unconscious for—" "He regained consciousness 2 days ago," Cole's attorney said. "His physicians can confirm his cognitive state has been carefully assessed and cleared for testimony." Walter was wheeled to the front of the courtroom, and when he spoke, his voice was thin with weeks of disuse, but steady, deliberate, every word chosen with the precision of a man who had been waiting a very long time to say them. "I want the court to understand something," Walter said, looking not at the judge but directly at his younger son. "I have not been confused for a very long time. I let everyone believe I was the doctors, the staff, my own family, because I no longer knew who in that house I could trust." His eyes moved slowly around the room, settling briefly on Ruby, something warm and grateful passing across his face before returning to Derek. "I began noticing irregularities in the company's accounts nearly a year ago. Small transfers at first, then larger ones. Every time I asked questions, Derek had an answer ready, too ready. So I stopped asking questions out loud, and I started writing down what I found instead, where I hoped no one would think to look for it, because a confused old man's scribbling draws far less scrutiny than a chairman's private ledger." Dad, Derek started, his voice cracking. "I am not finished," Walter said, and something in his tone, quiet as it was, silenced the room completely. "I chose to trust a young woman who had no idea what she was looking at, because she was the only person who came into that room without an agenda. She didn't erase what I gave her. Everyone else in my life did, Derek, including you." His voice wavered, grief moving underneath the steel of it. "I loved you. I love you still, God help me. But I will not let you hollow out everything your grandfather and I built, and I will not let you do it while calling me too broken to notice." The courtroom erupted into a controlled chaos of murmurs, the judge calling for order, Derek's attorneys huddling in urgent whispered conference. And it was in the middle of that chaos that a second attorney, one Ruby didn't recognize, seated near the back, rose with a folder of his own. "Your Honor, if I may. This is relevant to a related matter." He identified himself as representing the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit. The forensic trail submitted by the petitioner's counsel intersects with an active investigation into a separate individual, Grant Wexford of Wexford Properties, whose company appears to have knowingly laundered a significant portion of these funds through a series of real estate transactions. An arrest warrant was issued this morning. Ruby's breath caught. Beside her, Petey's eyebrows shot up in genuine shock. "He was going to marry into this family," Derek said, half to himself, some of his composure finally shattering entirely. "He told me it was clean. He told me—" "That's enough, mister," Ashby, the judge, said sharply, and the room fell silent again. It took the judge less than 20 minutes to rule. The guardianship petition was denied. A separate referral was made to the district attorney's office regarding the evidence of embezzlement. 2 officers moved quietly toward Derek's table. As the gallery began to stir and Ruby watched her heart pounding, as the man who had once sent a stranger to threaten her in her own lobby was led out through a side door in handcuffs, his practiced composure gone entirely, replaced by something raw and frightened, and for the first time genuinely human. Cole crossed the courtroom the moment the gavel fell, kneeling beside his father's wheelchair, gripping his hand tight, both of them fighting unsuccessfully to hold back tears in front of a room full of strangers. "You should have told me sooner," Cole said, his voice thick. "About all of it. I would have believed you." "I know that now," Walter said quietly. "I was afraid, son. Afraid of what I'd lose if I was wrong. Afraid of what I'd lose if I was right." His eyes found Ruby standing a few feet back, with Petey uncertain whether she belonged in this moment or not. "Come here, young lady." Ruby stepped forward, hesitant, and Walter reached for her hand with his free one, holding both his son and the woman who had kept his secret safe, something like peace finally settling over his exhausted face. "You saved this family," he said simply. "Both of you did. I hope you understand that." Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered, drawn by whatever whispers had leaked out of the hearing cameras flashing as Cole helped Ruby down the marble steps, his hand steady beneath her elbow, Petey close behind them both. For the first time in months, Cole Ashby stepped into the light of his own name without flinching from it, not the disguised man on Court Street, not the guarded chairman hiding behind boardroom doors, but simply a man walking beside the woman who had taught him on a freezing curb with nothing but a cup of soup between them. What it actually meant to be seen. A month in Triler, 2 weeks passed in the fragile, cautious quiet that follows a storm. Derek's assets frozen pending trial, Walter recovering steadily under his own physician's careful watch. Ruby settled back into her apartment now that the immediate danger had lifted, though Cole insisted, gently but firmly, on a car and driver, seeing her safely to and from every shift. It was Petey who found the last of it buried in a storage unit registered under one of Derek's shell companies. Boxes of financial records the district attorney's office had subpoenaed as part of the ongoing investigation. Petey had volunteered to help catalog them, a small, practical way of making himself useful, while Cole spent his days at his father's bedside, and his evenings increasingly at Ruby's small kitchen table. Most of the boxes held exactly what Petey expected: falsified invoices, shell company, paperwork, the dry architecture of a decade of quiet theft. But near the bottom of the last box, tucked inside a manila folder that seemed at first glance entirely unrelated to the embezzlement case, Petey found a stack of letters, bound with a faded ribbon, and beneath them a private investigator's report dated some 15 years earlier. He read the first page standing in the cold, fluorescent-lit storage facility, and had to read it a second time before he trusted that he'd understood it correctly. He called Cole that same night, his voice unsteady in a way Cole had rarely heard in 25 years of friendship. "You need to come to the office, now, and you need to sit down before you read what I'm about to show you." The letters were addressed to Walter, postmarked from a small town in Vermont, spanning nearly 2 decades. Petey had read enough of them to understand the shape of the story before Cole arrived, but he let his friend discover it in the woman's own handwriting, page by page, rather than summarizing what no summary could properly carry. "I think about him every single day," the earliest letter read, dated only a few years after Eleanor Ashby's supposed death. "I know you think this is easier for me because I chose it. It has never once been easier. Tell me he's well. Tell me he's happy. That's all I ask, and I know it's already more than I have any right to." Cole read it, standing in Petey's cluttered office, his hands trembling badly enough that Petey finally took the letter gently from him and set it on the desk. "There's a report, too," Petey said quietly. "From a private investigator your grandfather hired. Dated the year before your mother's obituary ran." Cole picked it up, and the story it told in flat clinical investigator's language was worse than anything he had imagined sitting alone in his father's study weeks earlier. Eleanor Ashby had discovered some 20 years ago the true extent of the family's criminal operations details. Walter, still young and still deeply entangled in his own father's business, had kept carefully hidden from her for years. She had confronted the old Don Cole's grandfather, directly threatening to go to federal authorities if the family didn't begin winding down its illegal operations, unwilling to raise a son inside a life built on the things she'd discovered. The old man's response, according to the investigator's carefully worded report, had not been persuasion. It had been an ultimatum: disappear permanently, quietly, in exchange for her son's safety and her own life, or don't and risk becoming exactly the kind of liability an organization like theirs did not allow to survive. "She left to protect me," Cole said, his voice hollow, reading the final page. "She didn't die. She was forced out. And Dad, he looked up at Petey, something breaking open behind his eyes. Dad knew. He staged the whole thing. The funeral. The obituary. 20 years of letting me believe she was dead when she was writing to him this entire time, begging for news of me. I think Petey said carefully, "Your father was a young man caught between his own father's cruelty and the only way he could find to keep both of you alive. I'm not saying it makes it right. I'm saying I don't think it was as simple as a lie told out of coldness." Cole didn't answer. He sat down heavily in the chair across from Petey's desk. The letters spread out before him, 20 years of a mother's grief laid bare in careful, aching handwriting, and let himself finally feel the full, staggering size of what had been taken from both of them. He confronted his father the following morning in the quiet of Walter's recovery room, the letters clutched in one hand. "You told me she was dead," Cole said. And his voice, when it finally broke, the silence was raw in a way Walter had never once heard from his son, not even as a grieving 8-year-old standing beside a closed casket. "I stood at her funeral. I grieved her for 20 years, Dad. I built my entire life around never letting anyone close enough to lose the way I lost her, and she was alive this whole time." Walter's face crumpled, the composure of the courtroom entirely gone, replaced by something old and devastated that Cole had genuinely never seen on his father before. "I know," he whispered. "I know what I took from both of you. Why? Why would you do that to a child? Because your grandfather made it very clear what would happen to her and to you if the world ever believed she was still alive somewhere. Still a loose end, still someone with knowledge that could destroy this family." Walter's hands trembled where they rested on the blanket. "I was 30 years old, Cole. I had no power to fight him. I made the only choice I believed would keep you both breathing. I let the world bury a woman who was very much alive. And I have carried that lie every single day since, telling myself it was mercy, when I think underneath it I was simply too much a coward to ever undo it once it was done. You could have told me. When grandfather died, when you took over, you had years, Dad. Years where the danger was gone and you still said nothing." "I was afraid," Walter said, simply tears finally slipping down his weathered face. "Afraid of what it would do to you to learn I'd let you grieve a lie for so long. Afraid of what it would do to her if I opened a door neither of us knew how to walk back through after 20 years apart. I told myself I was protecting you. I think in the end I was only protecting myself from having to face what I'd done." Cole stood very still, grief and fury and something rawer than either, warring behind his eyes, and for a long moment neither man spoke. It was Petey who broke the silence, appearing quietly in the doorway, his phone still in his hand. "Cole, there's something else you need to know. I tracked the return address on the most recent letters. She's not in Vermont anymore. She moved 18 months ago, closer than you'd think." He hesitated. "I think she's been keeping tabs on this family from a distance for a long time, and I think given everything that's happened with Derek, the threats against Ruby, the danger to the baby if she's heard any of it, she may already know more than we realize." As if summoned by the words themselves, a soft knock sounded at the hospital room door. A woman stood in the frame, older now, silver threading, through hair that had once been the same rich brown as Cole's, her face lined with 2 decades of a grief she had carried entirely alone, her eyes, Cole's eyes, unmistakably wide, with a fear and hope too large to contain. "I heard what happened," Eleanor Ashby said softly, her voice shaking. "I heard someone threatened a pregnant woman this family cares about, and I couldn't stay away any longer. Not this time, not when it might cost another mother what it cost me." Her gaze moved past Walter, settling on her son for the first time in 20 years, and something in her whole body seemed to break open with the weight of it. "Cole," she whispered. "My God, look at you." Cole stood frozen in the doorway of his father's hospital room, staring at a woman he had buried and mourned, and built an entire guarded life around losing, and felt for the first time since he was 8 years old, the ground beneath him shift into something he had never once let himself believe he'd feel again. For a long moment nobody in the room moved. Then Cole crossed the threshold in 3 unsteady strides and pulled his mother into his arms, and the sound that came out of him was one Petey had never once heard from his oldest friend in 25 years of friendship, a raw, broken sob of a boy who had spent 2 decades believing the worst thing in his life had already happened to him, only to discover it had never happened at all. "I'm here," Eleanor whispered into his shoulder, her hands fisted in the back of his sweater like she was afraid he might vanish if she let go. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry it took me this long to be brave enough to come back." "You're here now," Cole managed, his voice cracking apart. That has to be enough. It has to be." Behind them, Walter watched from his hospital bed, tears streaming freely down, a face that had held itself rigid and controlled for 20 years, and when Eleanor finally turned to look at him, Something passed between the two of them that no one else in the room could fully understand. Decades of grief, of impossible choices of love, distorted almost beyond recognition by fear. "I don't forgive you," Eleanor said quietly, and Walter flinched, but she crossed the room anyway and took his hand. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But I understand, Walter. I understood the day you sent that first letter back unopened, telling me it was safer that way. You were protecting our son the only way you knew how, even when it broke both of us to do it." Her voice wavered. "We lost 20 years we can't get back. But we don't have to lose whatever's left." Word of Eleanor Ashby's return spread quickly through the family, though Cole insisted firmly on keeping it away from reporters for as long as possible, wanting his mother's first weeks back to belong to their family alone rather than to the city's endless appetite for scandal. Ruby met her 3 days later in the same quiet hospital room and found herself unexpectedly undone by the way Eleanor took both her hands and simply said, "Thank you for keeping my husband's family together when I couldn't." The baby came 2 weeks after that, a girl exactly as Ruby had suspected all along, born on a gray morning with a cry loud enough to make the whole delivery room laugh through their exhaustion. Cole stood beside the bed the entire time, gripping Ruby's hand so tightly she'd later tease him about the bruises. And when the nurse finally placed the baby in Ruby's arms, Cole looked down at his daughter's small, furious face and felt for the first time in his adult life, absolutely certain of something, that whatever fear had kept him guarded for 20 years, he would not let it touch her. Not for a single day of her life. They named her Eleanor Rose, after both of the women who had taught the men in this family what it meant to love without condition. Eleanor for his mother, and Rose for Ruby's, whose own quiet, complicated love had never once stopped fighting for her daughter even when they disagreed about what that love should look like. Grant Wexford's trial concluded a month later, resulting in a lengthy sentence for fraud and money laundering. His family's name quietly scrubbed from every building it had once adorned. Derek's case moved more slowly through the courts, the weight of the evidence against him, leaving little room for the outcome to be anything other than certain, though Walter, in a decision that surprised everyone, including Cole, asked the district attorney's office to consider leniency in sentencing. Not forgiveness, he was careful to clarify, but the recognition that some cruelty is inherited before it is chosen, and that he bore no small responsibility for the cruelty and crowfer in sentencing, coldness in which he had raised both his sons. Cole proposed to Ruby on a quiet evening in early spring in the small kitchen of her Brooklyn apartment, rather than at any of the grand restaurants or rooftop venues his money could have easily arranged, kneeling on cracked linoleum with baby Eleanor asleep in her bassinet nearby, and told her simply that he didn't want their life together to begin anywhere but exactly where their story had, in a small, unglamorous room with nothing between them but the truth. "I spent 34 years believing that loving someone meant eventually losing them," he said, holding a ring that had notably belonged to no one before her. No family heirloom, no inherited weight, just something new, chosen entirely for the future rather than borrowed from a painful past. "You taught me that isn't the only ending available. You taught me on a freezing curb before you knew who I was, before there was anything in it for you at all. I don't ever want to stop learning that lesson from you for the rest of my life." Ruby said yes, with tears streaming down her face, and somewhere behind them, Petey invited over for dinner, and thoroughly failing to hide the fact that he'd been crying since the moment Cole got down on one knee, let out a whoop loud, enough to wake the baby. They were married that summer in a small backyard ceremony at Walter's Remsen Street townhouse. String lights strung between old maple trees, Eleanor walking her son down a makeshift aisle on one arm, while Deborah Hensley walked her daughter down the other. The two mothers who had once worried, each in her own way, about the choices their children were making, standing now side by side and understanding finally that love had found its way through, despite every fear either of them had carried. In the months that followed, Cole made good on a promise he'd made to himself in a hospital room months earlier. He dissolved what remained of his family's illegal operations, entirely cooperating fully with federal investigators to unwind decades of hidden infrastructure, and redirected a significant portion of the family's legitimate wealth into a new foundation established in his mother's name, Eleanor's Second Chance, dedicated to supporting single mothers and struggling families across Brooklyn with housing assistance, childcare, and job training. Ruby became its first director, turning the same fierce, unflinching compassion she'd once offered a stranger on a curb into something that would go on to change thousands of lives she would never personally meet. Walter lived long enough to see his granddaughter take her first steps in the garden, where his son had married the woman who saved their family, and on quiet evenings he would sit with Eleanor on the porch, the two of them slowly, carefully, rebuilding 20 years of lost conversation one evening at a Diane's a la Tem time. And Cole, The man who had once sat starving against a cold brick wall testing a city's capacity for kindness, learned finally at 35 years old that the wealth he had spent his whole life building meant nothing beside the small, ordinary miracle of a family that chose every single day to stay. If this story moved, you ask yourself the question it leaves behind. How many people have you walked past in your own life, certain they had nothing to offer, when the truth is that kindness never asks what it will get back before it gives? Real riches were never about money in this story. They were about a hand extended without calculation, a truth preserved when everyone else chose to erase it, and a family that finally found the courage to stop running from its own pain and start healing it together. What lesson did you take from this story? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear which part touched you the most. If you enjoyed this journey, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message today, leave a comment and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the next video.